I was initially rostered for this online service in May, whilst in Germany visiting the TGD together with Nanne. Renate Beilharz thought it might be of interest if I could speak about the working group's trip to Israel to tend the 2 Templar cemeteries there. This was fine, except that we hadn't yet flown to Tel Aviv. That May date was therefore swapped with Renate Weber's online service in August, and so here we are. My next challenge was to take the allocated text and see how best to weave it into or around the story of the past Templar settlements in Palestine and what they mean for us today. In short, I couldn't. Instead, I sought out another Bible text taken from the spare for July, since the spare for August also didn't help me, and tried to make that work. As it turns out, this other text, James chapter 2, verse 26, actually deals with good works and how it sits beside faith. While not specifically identifying which James he was, the verse's author is widely thought to be the younger half-brother of Jesus. James was not a follower during Jesus' time of ministry, but eventually became an apostle in the vein of Paul, as one who had seen and believed post the resurrection. James became one of the chief elders in the church at Jerusalem. As such, he wrote prior to the meeting of the Jerusalem Council. This council met in the year 49 of the Common Era, 49 CE, meaning James likely wrote his letter between the years 45 and 48 CE. It was possibly the first New Testament book written, heavily influenced by the Old Testament book of Proverbs, and frequently quoting Jesus' famous teaching, the Sermon on the Mount. And like Jesus, James was killed for his faith around 60 CE, according to Jewish historian Josephus. My chosen verse from the book of James comprises a single sentence and reads, "As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead." To better understand this concluding verse of chapter 2, one needs to consider what precedes it. I found this online commentary from Chuck Swindoll. No prizes for guessing he hails from the USA. Swindoll serves as senior pastor at Stonebriar Community Church in Frisco, Texas, and also offers leadership at the Dallas Theological Seminary. But his listening audience, both broadcasting a radio program since 1979, and his extensive writing ministry extend worldwide. On a website, he writes, "The book's consistent focus on practical action in the life of faith encourages God's people to act like God's people. The verses are filled with direct commands to pursue a life of godliness. James makes no excuses for those who do not measure up. In his mind, Christians prove their faith by walking in certain ways. For James, a faith that does not produce real-life change is a faith that is worthless. Throughout, he contends that faith produces authentic deeds, railing against the hypocritical believer who says one thing but does another. For James, faith is no abstract proposition, but has effects in the real world. He offers numerous practical examples to illustrate this. Faith endures in the midst of trials. Faith calls on God for wisdom, curbs the tongue, sets aside wickedness. Faith visits orphans and widows and does not play favourites. He stresses that faith is comprehensive, impacting every area of our lives and driving us to truly engage with other people in the world. While James recognises that even believers stumble, he also knew that faith should not coexist with people who roll their eyes at the less fortunate, ignore the plight of others, or curse those in their paths. Another Bible commentary, titled Theology of Work, indicates that the topic of work is detailed in the second part of chapter 2. James is describing any kind of work, from works of kindness, such as giving food to someone who is hungry, to on-the-job works, such as increasing the sustainable yield of grain crops. His use of the plural works shows that he expects the work of Christians to be continual and perhaps multidimensional. James chapter 2, verse 14 is arguably the centerpiece of his argument, where he says, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds?" He bluntly answers his own question by stating, "So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. As dead as someone in desperate need of food who receives only empty words of well-wishing from his neighbour." James takes it for granted that believing in Jesus, trusting in God, will move you to feel compassion for and act to help someone in need. We have opportunities every day to meet the needs of people we work and interact with. It can be as simple as making sure a confused customer finds the right item for their shopping, or noticing that a new employee requires help but is afraid to ask. James urges us to take special concern for those who are vulnerable or marginalised, and that we may need to practice noticing who these people are. James does not imagine that work is at odds with faith. He doesn't command Christians to work for the benefit of others in need instead of placing faith in Jesus, or even in addition to it. Rather, he expects that Christians will support those in need as a result of placing faith in Jesus. Referencing Abraham from the Old Testament, James in verse 22 says, "You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did." The commentary therefore suggests that we can never say, "I believe in Jesus and go to church, but I keep my personal faith out of my work." James describes that kind of faith as dead, with verse 24 stating, "You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone." The rest of the letter gives practical applications of the two underlying principles of trust in God and working to benefit others in need. These applications are outworkings of faith in Jesus, valid in James' day and instructive in ours. If I can put it simply, sometimes actions speak louder than words. Of course, the verse is written from a Christian perspective, unapologetically coupling a Christian faith with how we act with and towards others, particularly those in need. I have no doubt that the same philosophy applies equally well to other faiths. And similarly, I believe that those professing to be of no faith are also capable of good works. Everyone can and should. However, in this context, it did make me consider the actions of a former Australian Prime Minister, he a devout Pentecostal Christian. As a self-proclaimed man of faith, did Mr. Morrison keep his beliefs out of his work? If he did, I would ask why. And if he didn't, how can we explain his performance whilst in office? Clearly, politics is a dirty game with so very much at stake. But does it mean we leave our principles, our values, our ideals at the door? How we live reveals what we believe and whether the faith we profess to have is a living faith. I like to think that the Temple Society is just that, an active, living faith. Morning was his, and the year ahead, and the year that trailed after him. His was the balance of looking both ways, forwards and to the past, both at the same time. That's from a poem, At the Same Time, by Roma Ryan, she being the Northern Irish writer and poet, the primary lyricist for the singer Enya. While the main purpose of our group of nine's trip to Israel in May was to check on the condition of the Haifa and Jerusalem cemeteries, given COVID-19 had meant no direct interaction for a few years, there was sufficient time to tour parts of the country and visit the locations of the other Templar settlements as well. Bethlehem in Galilee, Jaffa, Sarona, and Wilhelma. In both Haifa and Jerusalem, the former German colonies are well signposted and attract many tourists. Personally, I would like to see a link to the present day, since the impression can easily be that the Temple Society is merely something of the past. Intriguingly, when we entered the Tourist Bureau, situated on Haifa's Ben Gurion Avenue, the former Kolonie Hauptstraße, and announced who we were, it didn't register with the woman behind the counter. Templar? Temple Society? No recognition whatsoever. It really is remarkable that Templar buildings from the 1800s and 1900s not only survived, but in many cases have been restored by Israelis. This is particularly evident in the southern section of what was the Sarona colony, the northern section still occupied by the military. At both Bethlehem and Wilhelma, their rural character, if not their original names, largely preserved, we hurriedly photographed houses and tried to match the names of property owners on our maps to what was unfolding before our eyes. A resident of Wilhelma, now Bnei Atarot, quizzed us as he drove into his driveway. On explaining our heritage, the young man invited us into his home, introduced his wife and son, showed a photograph on the wall of an Israeli working the fields behind his rental house, and asked questions about the settlement and its history. We will endeavour to find out who the original Templar owners were and some relevant family information for this property to send him. The lack of sufficient garden maintenance at the Haifa cemetery was starkly visible and palpably felt. Yet, after the initial disappointment, setting to with loppers, secateurs, and handsaws, wheelbarrows, rakes, and brooms, the grave plots and surrounds were starting to again look presentable. There was also time to work on the gravestone inscriptions, painstakingly applying paint with a pointed stick to the recessed lettering. This work, while extremely time-consuming, is also most satisfying. Armed with delicacies for afternoon tea, we were visited by the wife, Olivia, and son, Rabea, of the former gardener, Adnan Malchi. With little English between them, it was left to Karin Klingbeil with her fluent Arabic to stimulate conversation. Rabea had tried to continue the work of his late father, but he isn't a gardener and his heart wasn't really in it. Despite this, it was explained that he intended to visit the cemetery over a month of Fridays to bring it up to scratch. A day or so later, we were able to visit Professor Yossi Ben Arzi at the Haifa University. Karin told him of our intense dissatisfaction with the present gardener, a man his father and his grandfather all known to Yossi. He promised to meet with the chap, who was abroad at the time, and arrange for photographs showing progress to be sent before any further payment would be forthcoming. Similarly, we caught up with Professor Chaim Goren in Tiberias for dinner one evening. Both gentlemen, Yossi and Chaim, are most generous with their time and interest in the Templar past and how it reflects itself in the present. We benefit hugely from their connections and influence in Israel. Moving to Jerusalem, we were relieved to witness the cemetery there to be in a much better state. Still, the gardener had been dumping his plant refuse at the rear of the property, rather than disposing of it properly. Similarly, the local council had lopped tree branches overhanging the front wall and simply thrown them back onto the property. Luckily, no gravestones were damaged. Our main task was again gravestone lettering, as the elements over time wear the paint away. Somehow, the Borromeo sisters had dispensed of the paint tins and brushes left at the German hospice from previous visits. However, a quick visit to a nearby hardware store meant we weren't too inconvenienced. A lengthy section of the perimeter wall in the unused back section of the cemetery has collapsed, a victim of the extreme weather experienced in Jerusalem. This will require repair at considerable cost, but leaving it will only mean the damage extends to impact more and more of the wall. Living in a neighbouring street, we were invited to the home of Odette and Rachel Shaw and their 2 young sons. Odette has taken a personal interest in the upkeep of the cemetery since being present in his father's bakery, located on Emek Rephaim, and seeing past Templar groups walk by to attend to the graves of their forebears. This dedication so impressed him that he wants to do what he can to look after the site. Rachel is a lawyer and acted for the Temple Society in challenging one of the cemetery's neighbours when he began building over the boundary between the properties, damaging the exterior wall and depositing rubble from his development onto our side. In both locations, Haifa and Jerusalem, we Templars are fortunate to have these friends acting on our behalf. They do not share our faith, yet work hard for our benefit with no recompense. Returning to Germany after a memorable fortnight, I was somewhat taken aback to hear one TGD member disagree with the energy and resources afforded the maintenance of the cemeteries, believing it to be at the expense of current initiatives and endeavours. I must admit to never having heard such opposition to commemoration of our history. I think ideally it requires a balanced perspective. We need to live for the present, conscious of our past, yet striving for the future. Before World War II, all the Templar cemeteries in Palestine had their own cemeteries, with one shared by Jaffa and Sarona. In Haifa, the deceased from Bethlehem, Templar, and Waldheim, Protestant, are also buried, while in Jerusalem, those from Wilhelma, Sarona, and Jaffa can be found. More than 1,700 of our forebears had their remains laid to rest at these 2 cemeteries. We must also remember that the cemeteries, their upkeep and general condition, remain the responsibility of the Temple Society as a result of an official arrangement between the Israeli and German governments from last century. The TGD, acting also for the TSA, arranges for all running costs to be paid for from a fund created for the purpose, as well as through donations and, when required, additional contributions from both regions. Further, I believe that the legacy left by these founding generations is significant and requires remembering in whatever form we can. The ownership of past buildings, be they community or privately owned, has changed hands. But there is recognition by the Israelis of the Templars' contribution to the development of their country. By all means, we should not be mired in the past, but a rear view is respectful and can sometimes be revealing. His was the balance of looking both ways, forwards and to the past, both at the same time. Does your body have the spirit? Are your good deeds as a result of your faith? Thank you.
Together.